I'm going to start the lectures on this book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism by Chang. I'm not going to go through all of the uh, issues of the book, but this is going to be a sort of summary of some of the selected chapters that I want to discuss. So the first thing about the book and the general discussion around it is that it says um, we're talking here about issues with capitalism, and it's very important to see the distinction between our study of markets and the free market ideology or the capitalist ideology that Chang is speaking against. These two things are very distinct. The study of markets is one that looks at specific issues, technical issues that have to do with markets, as we've discussed throughout this course. And the free market ideology means making prescriptive or normative claims about how to create an organized society. It includes many things. So what are some of the differences? The first is that economic scholarship tends to be primarily positive or descriptive, whereas market ideology tends to be primarily normative, or perhaps not primarily normative, but has a very large normative or prescriptive element to it. The second thing is that our study of economics studies specific types of markets and human behavior, whereas market ideology makes claims more about systems and sort of extols the virtues of a system of where markets are widespread. The third thing is perhaps that economies, we understand in economics that economies exist on a spectrum from less to more regulated. So the less regulated an economy is, the more free market ethos it has, and the more regulated it is, you have more of a command system. Whereas market ideology tends to think of all of the different components of capitalism as a package deal. Finally, economics scholarship tends to be people tend to be more predisposed towards this idea of having strong opinions but holding them weakly and being willing to change our opinions of how the system works, how economies work, when we are exposed to new research. The research and study of economics is centered around that new addition to knowledge that we have. So we're never claiming certainty about our ideas. Whereas with market ideology, I don't want to say there's weak opinions, because there's some very sort of extraordinary scholars who have taken a very strong pro-market capitalist position, but those opinions tend to be very strongly held. This distinction that I'm making on this slide is artificial. There are people who, with weak opinions, strongly held or that purport to do economic science. There are people of the opposite, sort of with the opposite ethos, who are strong proponents of market ideology, and these are sort of more than the final word on the difference between economics, and capitalism. This is more sort of just to give you a flavor of that background. So the other thing to keep in mind is that, and this is a common thread through a lot of Chang's writing, that we have to remember that decisions are being made in an imperfect world. My problem with Chang is that when market failure occurs, he too often is willing to tolerate government intervention in allocations. And in some sense, this strikes me as being a little naive and ignoring of governance realities. So, for an example, consider allocation failures in irrigation. Water doesn't always go to the party that needs it, and so we have to think about ways to solve that. Australia has a water market, the Murray-Darling Basin has this water trading system where how much water gates are open at different times is transacted on. So you can trade whether water flows to you today with someone else for water flowing to you a week from now, for example. It's quite a sophisticated system. It's one of the few successful water markets in the world. In Pakistan, we use something called Varabandi, the etymology of which is Vahar Bandi, or fixed turns. You have fixed turns to draw water from a water channel or khala. And Ali Akram, our colleague, has a work on the Hakra branch canal, where he shows that people who are closer to the mouth of the canal, right? So these are people who are more. So here's the canal going through, and if you're closer to the canal, then you get water quicker, and you often end up taking more water than is your right. And as the water flows downstream, people at the end are less able to use that water. Now, there are there are diminishing marginal utilities to using water, which means that the more water you use, the less you need it. And so these people at the end who don't have that water tend to have tend to have more need for it than the people who are using it. So let's say that you have 50 units of water, and you have the right to using 50 units of water, and you end up using 20 more as an upper riparian. So you're using 70 units of water. That 70th unit is still useful to you, but the extra crop that you'll get out of that, the last 20 units that you're using, that were allocated actually to this guy, are worth less in terms of the crop that you're producing. In fact, if you had let that water flow through, and so this guy was able to use it, perhaps he could have produced 30 units of crop, or what have you. So, but the reason that you don't do it is because the crop that you grow on your land obviously fattens your wallet, whereas if you let the water go, the economy as a whole is benefited, but you as the upper riparian don't end up making that. Now, so this is the type of problem that we're dealing with. Contrast that with the Murray-Darling Basin, where it's not so much whether you have the right, but you are now able to tweak whether the allocated right is worth it for you. So let me give you an example of that. Suppose that we have a system like Varabandi, which is every 5 days you get 50 units of water, or every week you get 50 units of water. Now perhaps at some point, and this happens in Pakistan obviously and everywhere, perhaps at some point your crops don't need water right now. Perhaps you're in the middle of harvesting, or perhaps you're letting your land life sort of unused to rotate crops, or perhaps your crop is at the point where you've just spread some fertilizer out, and irrigating it with water today will actually harm it because the fertilizer will get diluted. Whatever it might be, there might be times when your allocated turn is not really worth it to you, and so what you do is you would ideally like to say, well, I don't need the water today. Does anyone else need it? And if so, I'm willing to accept your money in order to give you the water. That's the intuition behind what the Murray-Darling Basin is doing. That's the beauty of markets, where disaggregated supply and demand decisions can be organized in a cohesive way, can allow for better and more efficient use of water where it is necessary on a given day. Contrast that with us. Our main problem, or one of the main problems that we have, is that you're not getting your turn in time. So water markets would fail in Pakistan, but not because we needed government intervention, which is what, reading between the lines of the book, is what Chang might suggest. But instead, we need governance correction or the enforcement of property rights, as I've also talked about in the past. The so the broad lesson I want to leave you with is that you have to think about the balance between market failures and government failures always. You can't just sort of say market isn't working well, the government should do this or the government should do that, as Chang seems to suggest at times. The preface to the book, and this is where I really like what Chang is trying to do, is that it's very important to make sure that you, whether you go on to be econ majors or not, become active economic citizens. And what does that mean? It means that you are willing to understand and hold opinions about the economy. What does it not mean? It means you're not trying to become a senior tajjakar, willing to weigh in with a strong opinion on something. But instead, what I suggest that you do is, one, that you understand the basics, understand first principles of economics, which is what your Econ 100 class and this class and your principles of micro class and macro class will give you. Second is be willing to listen to experts and not be sort of dismissive of expertise. The third is to be curious, and this is really important. What is your opinion of the ongoing sugar industry scandal in our country, and why? Do we need to have a sugar industry? Do we need to have a sugar industry that is subsidized? What are the main issues of that scandal? And what should we do about it? The fact that you're not yet an expert doesn't mean that you don't form an opinion and discuss it with others. And so, again, I'd suggest that you think of this as time for you to take your opinions and you hold them weakly in the sense that if someone comes in and suggests that your ideas about this might be wrong because of some other reason, you're willing to accept that. But have opinions and be proactive in learning about the world, because if you have opinions, that's when conversations start. And society, the way democracies work, no voter always has an understanding of every issue. So it's important that we think of that, but we have to be willing to engage with these problems, with economics, with defense spending, with cultural issues, with religion, what have you. We have to form opinions and we have to discuss those opinions, because ultimately, when we go to vote, we can't be clueless. The value of a democracy lies in the strength of your opinions, and so that's what I mean. And I really sort of value what Chang is trying to do there by the idea of active economic citizenship. Now let's move to this first chapter of the book. This idea that there is no such thing as a free market, and this is something that I absolutely agree with. But first, let's just do a recap, and this is based on his recap of why economists prefer to have free markets. A restriction on free exchange leads to what we call deadweight losses, which are potential gains from trade that were unrealized due to a restriction on free exchange. And so, if you're saying, for example, that someone can only buy 10 units of an item, and that's a rule, then there will be circumstances where the 11th unit was one that they were willing to buy at a price higher than the seller was willing to sell it at, which means that both the seller would be happy and the buyer would be happy by buying an 11th unit of that item. But we decided at some point that this is really more the topic of the next chapter, we might want to allow that or not allow that. The key thing, I think Chang really hits the nail on the head there, is to sort of make clear that how free a market is cannot be objectively defined, it is a political definition. So a year ago, I was fortunate enough to visit the African country of Benin. Benin was the subject of substantial slave trade. And so I had the privilege of going and visiting the area where they would traffic the slaves from. And there were harrowing stories where people were bound and gagged and sort of taken to. Uh, this picture that I have here is a place underneath which there were caves where they would store quote unquote, keep slaves right before they were shipped out, when the ship hadn't really arrived. And the ships, this is a map of the type of ship that was used. As you can see, there are the people on every level. There were people they were packed like the sardines, and it was just really harrowing. So, slave trade there happened from 1553 to the 1840s. In all of African transatlantic trade of slaves, there were about 12 million Africans that were shipped across at that time. Remember that populations were much lower in those years, so this is an outsized proportion of their population. In most places, all able-bodied men first, and then women and children even were shipped across. Entire villages and entire regions were devastated by this. Millions more died en route. People were raped and tortured. And even today, Africa is scarred by slave trade. But the key point for Chang's perspective is that slavery was allowed. It was legal to have slaves. He has a nicer, perhaps not nicer, but he has a less well-known example, which is the Cotton Factories Regulation Act of 1819. And that's when it was decided that the law would mandate 9 years minimum age, which means, and 12 hours maximum work per day, which means that, think about that, it means that people were being made to work every day for more than 12 hours, or perhaps more tragically, kids less than 9 years of age were being made to work in these factories before the law came in. And so again, before that, and even at this point, in 1819, the government was saying, the UK government was saying that it's okay to have a 9-year-old work in a factory for 12 hours a day. And so that's what Chang is arguing is the sort of crux of the matter. You are free to employ a 9-year-old in a factory for 12 hours. You are free to ship an African over to another country against his will. These are sort of maybe the most striking examples of what it means to say that what it means to have free markets is politically defined. Today, we are not free to put people into slavery. We are not free to put a child into heavy labor or any sort of labor. But we don't say that that's not a free market. Right? So this sort of broad capitalist idea of free markets needs to be thought of from the lens of, well, what are you defining as being possible or not? In today's day, the political question is, should employers be responsible for paying workers at this time, right? So you have factories that have suddenly shut down. Workers are being sent home. Are you responsible for paying the person? This is something that ultimately has a political answer. Economics has no good or bad answer to it. What economics can do is give you suggestions for what will happen to the market for workers if employers have to operate under these laws versus other laws, right? So employers will typically have to buy insurance to pay workers when they're out of a job, which means that your per laborer cost goes up. And so we can predict that to some degree, employers are more likely to substitute away towards technologies that don't require more workers if you have these laws. But that's not to say that that's a bad thing to do. So it's very important that you understand this difference between descriptive economic science and prescriptive market ideology. So why are some markets restricted? And the first one is votes, right? So you're not allowed to buy a vote. Another one is you're not allowed to buy a judgment. The reason for these first two market restrictions is that there are rules to the election game, if you will, that require that people honestly put forth their opinion about how to be governed. If you were to have the rich be more politically influential by giving them the right to bid on and contribute resources, and then we'd see who contributes the most to running the economy, and they get to run it like an auction. If you were to auction off the government, then what that would do is it would mean that the voice of the people would be regulated by how much money they had. So the rich would have a greater political voice, and the poor would have would have less access to politics, and that has impact on how societies are governed. So if you've decided that the rule of the game is that if you're going to be if you're going to run for an election, you're not allowed to buy votes, then we're trying to say that regardless of whether you're rich or poor, you have the theoretical right to try to be the next prime minister, and there's value in that. The law is what is the law? The law is supposed to be getting us away from de facto situations. De facto means as is on the ground realities, right? So the law of the jungle is might is right, and the law of societies, of civilized societies, of humanity, is that might is not always right. And to regulate what is decided, we have what we hope will be uninfluenced judges who are not influenced by either fear or by greed. And so we're not allowed to buy decisions for that reason. In fact, if you were able to buy decisions, and where you're able to buy decisions, justice is immediately lost. You're also not allowed to buy guns, or perhaps you have some restrictions on buying guns. In some places, you're not allowed to buy guns at all. In other places, you can buy guns, but you have to be registered and you have to show a legitimate need for a gun. For example, you have area to protect where the police doesn't reach, for example. This is obviously because we don't want to sell guns and have you create negative externalities on others. We don't want you to go and shoot people up. We also don't have markets in no balls. Why don't we have markets for no balls? Why shouldn't a player be able to sell poor performance? At some level, he will internalize that poor performance by virtue of doing less well in a cricket match, and then will potentially suffer the consequences. The reason that we don't allow this is obviously that this is not transparent. So we tune in to watch a match thinking that everyone is exerting themselves fully, and these sort of side transactions get in the way of a fully honest experience for the customer. So obviously this is corruption. Another type of market restriction is in the sale of recreational drugs of certain types. So this is, I believe, ecstasy. And why do we do that? We do it because we have a strong paternalistic approach. We have a strong society decides that it knows better than the consumer at a given point about what they should be consuming. Then we have restrictions on where by law you have, so if you go and buy, for example, a laptop or a battery for a laptop or something, um, the manufacturer has liability in case the thing suddenly explodes. Why is that? So the reason that we don't allow manufacturers to sell items as is in some markets is because we think that the cost to a consumer of understanding whether a laptop is likely to burst is very high. We would need to strip down the thing that we're thinking of buying and be technically able to then figure out the probability of an explosion and then put the thing back again. And if we don't like it, then we move on to the next one. That's clearly too much for any consumer. And so we take the benefit of product liability laws, which, by making sure that any explosion becomes the headache of the manufacturer, incentivizes them at the design and production process to reduce the chance of that ever happening. Um, we also have import restrictions, which Chang talks about quite assertively and correctly. I think um, the most capitalist countries in the world have never had completely free immigration, which means that they have restricted the supply of labor. And if you restrict the supply of labor, obviously, then you're not going to have a completely free market outcome. Um, there are, you can argue about whether those immigration restrictions should exist or not. There are legitimate worries in those countries about how their politics and culture might be impacted by the influx of new workers, but still means that we don't always have free markets. And finally, we have financial regulations where we sometimes disallow money from flowing very quickly into or out of financial markets because we're worried that that will create turbulence in the stock market. So, in conclusion, there really is no such thing as a free market. Let me pause here and we'll start on the next chapter in a minute.